My name is Jessica. I didn't lose my job the day I was fired. I lost it much earlier, the moment my work became invisible and my silence was mistaken for compliance. The firing was just the formality that followed. People think the end of a career is loud, dramatic, unforgettable. It isn't. It's quiet. It happens in well-lit rooms with polite language and carefully chosen words that erase years of contribution in under 10 minutes. That morning, everything looked normal. Too normal. The lobby lights were warm, the security gate responded instantly to my badge, and the digital board near reception cycled through the company's values like it always did: integrity, velocity, innovation. I noticed the time without meaning to. 8:12 a.m. I always arrived at 8:12. Not because I had to, but because systems run better when time is treated as exact, not approximate. That habit alone should have told them who I was. I walked to my desk and saw the envelope waiting for me. Plain white. No logo. No handwriting. Just placed neatly at the corner, like it didn't want to draw attention to itself. I didn't open it right away. I sat down, powered on my laptop, and checked my calendar. 2 meetings were gone. Not rescheduled. Removed. Both were meetings I had designed, meetings that didn't function without me. That was the first confirmation. Not suspicion, confirmation. I opened the envelope then. 1 sentence. Jessica, please join us in conference room B at 9 a.m. No subject. No explanation. I didn't need one. When you've spent years designing escalation paths, you recognize one when you're standing inside it. I made coffee. Black. No sugar. I leaned against the counter longer than usual, not because I was tired in the physical sense, but because my body was catching up to something my mind had already processed. Burnout doesn't arrive with panic. It arrives with acceptance. The kind that settles in your chest and makes everything suddenly very clear. Conference room B was cold, exactly as I had specified years earlier. Cooler rooms keep people alert. That detail mattered when decisions carried consequences. 3 people were waiting for me: the CEO, the head of HR, and a junior legal representative. Not senior legal. That absence told me more than anything they could have said. This wasn't a discussion. It was execution. The CEO spoke first, smiling the way executives do when they believe politeness can soften impact. He thanked me for my time. He talked about growth, about acceleration, about a new direction. He said the company needed leaders who could move faster, who weren't weighed down by excessive process. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked one question. When something breaks, I said calmly, who absorbs the failure? He didn't answer. He nodded to HR instead. The termination letter slid across the table. Effective immediately. Access revoked. Transition handled. The language was neutral, refined, bloodless. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shocked. I felt something much quieter settle in its place. Clarity. They told me it wasn't personal. I nodded because it was true. Corporate decisions rarely are. They're procedural. What makes them painful is how casually they erase context. Years of stabilizing budgets, renegotiating supplier agreements, designing redundancies that prevented collapse, all reduced to a line item labeled resistance. I walked back to my desk without an escort. No one stopped me. A few people looked up and then looked away. Relief and fear mixed the same way on office floors. Everyone understands what just happened. No one wants to be next. I packed slowly. My notebook, the one with page numbers and clause references written in pencil. My charger. A framed photo from the year we finally turned profitable. My badge stopped working before I reached the elevator. That part was almost impressive. Speed, at last. In the elevator, I watched my reflection. Calm. Controlled. Not broken. People expect collapse. They expect tears or rage or pleading. What they don't expect is someone who understands exactly what just changed and exactly what didn't. I sat in my car for a moment after leaving the building. I didn't call anyone. I didn't replay the conversation. I thought about structure. About contracts. About decisions made years earlier when the company was fragile and desperate and willing to listen to people who understood risk instead of performance. I remembered the clause buried deep in one agreement, the one no executive ever read past the summary page. The one designed not for punishment, but protection. That was the moment I understood something important. They thought they had removed an obstacle. What they had actually done was remove the person who had been absorbing the consequences on their behalf. I started the engine, already aware that the story didn't end with my exit. It was only just beginning. And the next phase wouldn't require confrontation, or emotion, or even my presence inside the company. It would require something far more effective. It would require the system to speak for itself. I didn't drive away immediately. I sat there with the engine running, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the building through the windshield like I was seeing it for the first time. Glass, steel, symmetry, everything about it suggested control. What most people never understand is that buildings don't represent power. Agreements do. By the time I pulled out of the parking lot, the shock had fully drained from my body. What remained wasn't anger. It was focus. Anger is loud and wasteful. Focus is economical. And I had spent years learning how to conserve energy for the moments that mattered. I went home, not to collapse, not to drink, not to vent. I changed clothes, washed my hands, and opened my laptop. The same one I had used to build half the operational backbone they were now trying to outrun. Muscle memory took over. Folder by folder. Version by version. I didn't search randomly. I knew exactly where everything lived. Preparation has a geography of its own. The document I was looking for wasn't dramatic. No bold title. No warning language. Just a clean, carefully drafted agreement from years earlier, created during a time when the company didn't have the luxury of arrogance. Back then, survival mattered more than speed. Back then, people listened when I spoke about risk. I scrolled slowly, not because I needed to find the clause, but because rereading something you once wrote reinforces certainty. The language was still solid. Tight. Clear. No ambiguity. Governance change. Material operational restructuring. Automatic adjustment. Market-based recalculation. Notification window, 24 hours. No loopholes. No emotion. Just mechanics. I leaned back and closed my eyes, not in relief, but in recognition. This wasn't an opportunity one was creating. It was a consequence they had already agreed to. Long before new leadership arrived. Long before confidence replaced caution. Long before my role became inconvenient. That evening, my phone stayed silent. Inside the company, they were still celebrating momentum, still mistaking quiet for compliance. The CEO probably believed the day had ended cleanly. One less obstacle. One decisive action. I knew better. Systems don't fail loudly at first. They shift. Subtly. Then everything else reacts. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not out of anxiety, but habit. I made coffee, sat at my desk, and drafted one email. Just one. No explanation. No justification. The subject line was intentionally dull: contractual adjustment notice, effective tomorrow. Dull emails get read by the right people. I addressed it carefully. Property administration. Finance visibility. Legal. Board distribution. No unnecessary names. No missing ones. I kept the body short. 2 paragraphs. Clause reference. Effective date. That was it. I read it 3 times, not to soften it, but to remove anything that sounded like commentary. Contracts don't need tone. They need accuracy. I sent it at 10:30 a.m. Timing matters. Early enough to trigger review. Late enough to disrupt planning. Then I waited. The first call came less than 15 minutes later. Finance. The voice on the other end was tight, controlled, trying not to sound alarmed. Jessica, there must be some confusion, he said. I didn't correct him. Confusion is the first stage of recognition. I asked him to review the clause and call me back. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. Legal followed. Slower. More careful. When they called back, the question they asked wasn't emotional. It was technical. You're no longer an employee, the attorney said. Correct. I confirmed it. There was a pause. Then conflict of interest doesn't apply. That was the moment the ground shifted. By mid-afternoon, the calls changed tone. Less disbelief. More urgency. The CEO finally called me directly. No greeting. No courtesy. Just accusation. He said I was retaliating. Sabotaging. Weaponizing access. I let him speak. When he finished, I said one sentence. Read what you signed. Silence followed. Heavy. Disbelieving. I ended the call. Inside the company, the ripple effects had already begun. Finance recalculated projections. Procurement froze approvals. Vendors asked questions that hadn't been asked in years. Is everything stable? Stability is expensive once it's questioned. And once questioned, it spreads. The CEO called again that evening. His voice was different. Lower. Less certain. He asked if we could talk. I told him the truth. This isn't a conversation, I said. It's a process. He didn't like that. People who rely on authority rarely do. I slept that night without interruption. Deep, unbroken sleep. That surprised me. Burnout lifts when clarity replaces obligation. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying a system on my back. I was watching it function exactly as designed. By the next morning, the board had noticed. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Invitations went out. Mine arrived quietly. His didn't. That was when I understood the difference between control and leverage. Control needs presence. Leverage works without you. I prepared my documents calmly. Not to defend myself. To let the record speak. Dates. Signatures. Approvals. Everything clean. Everything unambiguous. I wasn't going to that meeting to argue. I was going to observe accountability arrive. And when it did, it wouldn't need my voice. It would only need the truth. The boardroom looked different when I walked in, even though nothing had changed. Same table. Same chairs. Same glass wall overlooking the city that executives loved to reference when they talked about big-picture thinking. What had changed was the atmosphere. Silence carries weight when it's earned, and that room was heavy with it. No one checked their phone. No one smiled unnecessarily. Every person there understood that this meeting hadn't been scheduled, it had been triggered. I took my seat without ceremony. No greeting. No small talk. That absence was intentional. When people are uncomfortable, they reach for politeness. I wasn't there to comfort anyone. The chair of the board spoke first. She didn't mention my termination. She didn't mention conflict. She referenced numbers. Revised projections. Liquidity exposure. Contractual recalculations. She spoke slowly, clearly, like someone who had spent the last 12 hours being briefed by people who finally realized they didn't understand the system they were governing. When she finished, she looked directly at me. "We need clarity," she said. I nodded once. Not agreement. Permission. I didn't start with emotion or history. I started with chronology. The date the agreement was signed. The conditions under which it applied. The reason the clause existed. I reminded them calmly that it had been designed during a period when the company had no margin for error. When one misstep could have collapsed vendor confidence entirely. When continuity mattered more than optics. No one interrupted. They couldn't. Interruptions are tools of dominance, and dominance only works when the structure supports it. Here, the structure was on my side. The CEO finally spoke. His voice carried restraint, but not control. "You could have warned us," he said. That sentence told me everything. Not "is this accurate?" Not "is this valid?" Just regret that the consequences had arrived without rehearsal. "I did," I replied. "Years ago. In writing." That landed harder than any accusation could have. Because it reframed the narrative. This wasn't a personal dispute. It was delayed accountability. Legal attempted to introduce nuance. Alternative interpretations. Potential renegotiation. I listened, then responded with the same calm precision I had used when drafting the clause in the first place. "Interpretation requires ambiguity," I said. "This doesn't have any." There was a pause. Then a subtle shift. One board member leaned back. Another adjusted their papers. That was the moment power began to redistribute, not toward me, but away from certainty. And uncertainty is dangerous in leadership. They asked what I wanted. That question is always revealing. It assumes intent. Desire. Revenge. Something negotiable. "I don't want anything," I said. "I'm not asking." The adjustment has already occurred. Silence followed again, but this time it was different. This silence wasn't resistance. It was recalculation. The CEO's position was suddenly fragile. Not because he had made a single mistake, but because he had mistaken speed for authority. He had removed friction without understanding what that friction was absorbing. Leaders like that don't fall because of enemies. They fall because systems stop protecting them. The meeting ended without resolution, which was itself a resolution. They didn't reverse my termination. They didn't threaten me. They didn't demand concessions. They adjourned. Adjournment is what happens when no one is confident enough to push. In the days that followed, the effects multiplied quietly. Vendor terms tightened. Compliance reviews surfaced. Questions that had been deferred resurfaced with urgency. Each one traced back to processes I had once managed, now exposed without buffer. I wasn't involved. That was the point. The CEO stopped calling. HR stopped emailing. Legal remained active, but distant, cautious, aware that every sentence they wrote might one day be read aloud. That awareness changes how people behave. I felt something unexpected during that week. Lightness. Not victory, release. For years, my value had been measured by how much pressure I could absorb without complaint. Now, for the first time, the pressure belonged where it always should have. One evening, I walked past the building again. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. The glass reflected the city, indifferent as ever. Buildings don't care who runs them. Systems do. I realized then that this story was never about being fired. It was about what happens when quiet competence is removed from an ecosystem that mistakes silence for weakness. They had learned something irreversible. And so had I. What surprised me most wasn't the company's reaction. It was my own nervous system. For the first time in years, my shoulders weren't tight when I woke up. My jaw wasn't clenched. The low-grade tension that had become background noise in my body had faded so gradually that I hadn't noticed it leaving. Burnout doesn't disappear dramatically. It dissolves when responsibility realigns. I started noticing small things again. The way morning light hit the kitchen counter. The sound of water boiling without urgency. Time moved differently when it wasn't borrowed against someone else's expectations. I didn't fill the space immediately. I let it exist. Professionally, the fallout continued without me. A former colleague messaged, carefully, indirectly, asking if I was doing okay. I understood what she really meant. I replied simply, I am. That was the truth, and it unsettled her more than any explanation would have. A week later, I received a formal request from the board. Not an invitation. A request. They wanted a written clarification, technical, non-opinionated, on the operational dependencies I had once overseen. The phrasing mattered. They weren't asking for help. They were asking for accuracy. I responded with a document. 10 pages. No commentary. Just mappings. Inputs. Outputs. Dependencies. Risk gradients. I didn't soften it. I didn't dramatize it. I presented the system exactly as it was. Reading it would be uncomfortable. That wasn't my problem. Inside the company, the CEO's authority was narrowing. Not publicly. Quietly. Decisions began routing around him. Board members requested direct verification from departments. HR paused initiatives. Finance slowed approvals. None of it was labeled a failure. But momentum had shifted, and momentum is the most honest indicator of power. I wasn't enjoying this. That distinction mattered to me. Enjoyment implies hunger. I felt none. What I felt was alignment. Things were landing where they should have all along. Then came the call I hadn't expected. Late afternoon. Unknown number. The CEO again. His voice was restrained, but stripped of certainty. He didn't accuse this time. He asked a question. If things had gone differently, he said, would you still be here? I thought about it before answering. If things had gone differently, I replied, this conversation wouldn't be happening. He didn't respond. The call ended quietly. That night, I slept without dreams. The next morning, I declined the board's follow-up meeting. Politely. Professionally. Finality doesn't need explanation. They acknowledged the decline without resistance. That told me everything. I began thinking about what came next, not in terms of ambition, but intention. For years, my work had been defined by containment. Preventing collapse. Absorbing risk. Protecting others from their own decisions. That role has an expiration date, whether you acknowledge it or not. I reviewed offers I had ignored before. Consultative roles. Advisory positions. Structures where clarity was valued over compliance. Where boundaries weren't treated as obstacles. I accepted one. Quietly. On my last interaction with the company, I returned one thing, the badge. Not because they asked, but because I no longer needed anything tying me to that chapter. The receptionist looked surprised. I smiled once, briefly. Closure doesn't require witnesses. As I walked away, I understood something fundamental. Power isn't reclaimed through confrontation. It's reclaimed through refusal. Refusal to carry weight that was never yours. Refusal to remain in systems that survive by draining the people who stabilize them. The company would continue. They always do. But it would do so without the illusion that quiet competence is infinite. And I would continue too. Lighter. Clearer. Unavailable to anything that required me to disappear in order to function. Distance does something important. It removes urgency, and with it, distortion. Weeks passed without incident. No calls. No updates. The company faded into abstraction, like a place you once lived in that no longer holds emotional geography. I noticed how little mental space it occupied now, and that absence felt earned. My new role was different in a way that was immediately noticeable. No one mistook silence for availability. No one expected me to absorb uncertainty on their behalf. When I spoke, people listened, not because of authority, but because clarity had become a resource they respected. I worked fewer hours and produced better outcomes. That ratio alone was proof of something I had suspected for years but never had the margin to test. Exhaustion is not evidence of importance. It's often just evidence of misalignment. Occasionally, news reached me indirectly. A senior resignation. A delayed expansion. A regulatory review that arrived earlier than expected. None of it surprised me. Systems reveal themselves when pressure shifts. I didn't track details. I didn't need to. The pattern was familiar. One afternoon, I found the old notebook I had packed on my last day. I opened it slowly, flipping through pages of diagrams, margin notes, cross-references written in pencil. I had built entire architectures in those pages, structures no one ever saw because they worked. That invisibility had once bothered me. Now, it felt like confirmation. Recognition is seductive. It keeps people in rooms long after they should leave. I had stayed because I believed responsibility was a form of loyalty. I had been wrong. Responsibility without authority is extraction, not leadership. I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who believed competence would always be noticed eventually. I didn't feel bitterness toward her. Only understanding. She had done what she knew how to do. She had learned what the system rewarded and what it quietly consumed. There was a moment, one evening, when I realized I hadn't checked my email all day. Not out of avoidance. Out of absence. That reflex, the constant readiness to respond, had finally shut off. My body had recalibrated before my mind caught up. The company's story would be written without me now. That was appropriate. Stories don't need all their architects present to conclude. Some exits are structural, not emotional. What remained was something simpler and more durable, self-trust. I had listened when something felt wrong. I had acted without theatrics. I had chosen clarity over comfort, boundaries over validation. That choice had cost me a title. It had given me something better. Time. Agency. And the knowledge that when systems fail, it's not always because people are weak, sometimes it's because the wrong people were carrying the weight. I no longer was. Closure doesn't arrive the way people expect. It doesn't come with apologies or acknowledgments or formal recognition of what was lost. It arrives when the nervous system stops bracing for impact. When the body understands, before the mind does, that the danger has passed. I noticed it one morning while standing at the window, watching traffic move without pattern or urgency. There was nothing I needed to anticipate. No inbox to monitor. No decision waiting to escalate. That absence wasn't emptiness. It was completion. Work settled into rhythm. Clean. Bounded. Intentional. I advised when asked. I declined when it wasn't aligned. No justification required. That freedom was new, and I treated it carefully. Freedom mishandled becomes chaos. I had learned that lesson watching others confuse speed with direction. Months later, I received one final message connected to the company. Not from leadership. Not from legal. From someone junior, someone who had watched quietly. She wrote to thank me, not for protecting her, but for leaving. She said my exit had clarified something she hadn't been able to name. That staying wasn't always strength. That endurance wasn't always noble. I read that message twice. Then I closed it. Some things don't need replies. The company eventually stabilized, in its own way. It always would. Systems adapt. People rotate. Titles change hands. What doesn't always recover is institutional memory, the quiet understanding of why things were built the way they were. That loss would show up later, in places no one would immediately connect to my absence. I didn't feel responsible for that. Responsibility has limits. Recognizing them is part of maturity. I thought about the moment I had been fired, how small it had felt, how procedural. How they believed the story ended there. It hadn't. It had simply changed narrators. There was no revenge in what followed. No satisfaction in watching imbalance correct itself. Only confirmation. Confirmation that clarity, once acted on, doesn't need reinforcement. It stands on its own. I didn't explode. I didn't threaten. I didn't beg. I walked away. And in doing so, I reclaimed something that had been quietly eroding for years, my sense of proportion. My understanding of worth. My refusal to remain where my presence was required but my voice was optional. That is what choosing yourself looks like, not loud, not dramatic, not vindictive. Just precise. Just final. Just clear. People often ask what I learned from that chapter, as if experience can be reduced to a sentence, as if meaning arrives neatly packaged. It doesn't. Meaning arrives gradually, after distance has stripped the story of its noise. What I learned is this: most systems don't collapse because of malice. They collapse because they become accustomed to invisible labor. They learn to depend on people who don't demand acknowledgement, and then they mistake that generosity for permanence. I was never irreplaceable. That idea is a trap. But the way I worked, the discipline, the foresight, the refusal to confuse urgency with importance, that combination was rare. Not because it was exceptional, but because it required restraint. And restraint is often misunderstood as a lack of ambition. I think about how easily my departure was framed as efficiency. A clean cut. A necessary evolution. Those narratives are comforting to the people who benefit from them. They allow accountability to dissolve into language. But language doesn't change outcomes. Structure does. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about alignment. About what happens when you stop offering your nervous system as collateral for someone else's growth strategy. About the moment you recognize that loyalty without reciprocity isn't virtue, it's erosion. If there's a warning here, it's a quiet one. Pay attention to the rooms where your competence is welcomed but your boundaries are tolerated. Pay attention to the roles that expand without authority, to the praise that replaces protection, to the exhaustion that's framed as commitment. Those are not signs of value. They are signs of extraction. Walking away doesn't always mean leaving immediately. Sometimes it means preparing yourself to no longer be needed. Sometimes it means letting the system experience the weight it assigned to you. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't issue ultimatums. I didn't wait for validation. I chose clarity over comfort. Structure over sentiment. Self-respect over survival. And when I look back now, I don't see a loss. I see a correction. Because the moment you stop shrinking to fit a system that relies on your silence, something fundamental shifts. The story changes. The power recalibrates. And for the first time in a long time, you sleep, not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer betraying yourself to keep something else standing. That is the ending. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just honest.